Hello, all. All right. This is going to be chapter 22 on incrementalism by Michael Hayes. We've touched on some of this before, a lot actually, on why sort of incrementalism tends to be the approach, right? We sort of tinker at the margins generally, unless we have that sort of punctuated equilibrium or a crisis or, mass revolt kind of thing. And so this chapter will very much sort of focus on the foundational theoretical and empirical evidence we have for why this sort of incrementalism tends to occur, and even if it's the best choice or not, which is sort of a big policy and philosophy question, even, and a big question about the effectiveness of sort of the parliamentary system with very few veto points and a melded government and the sort of federalist checks and balances system of the U.S. with high veto levels, right from paper one, um, and whether that's good normatively. So this is kind of a strange chapter for me because I don't like normative stuff. I like to think out how I want to put it together and where I fall on it. I don't like people to tell me how to feel about something. And maybe that's a little biased because I come up, data, 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 data all the time. Um, but the best journalism and the best science and all this kind of stuff, they just sort of present an argument and let it be, right? And so this was sort of a weird chapter for me. All right. Chapter 22.2, Incrementalism as an Alternative to the Rational Ideal. And this is mostly based through the foundational work of Lindbaum from 1965. Um, so the question is, why does the rational best choice ideal approach almost never happen in reality? And we've talked about all kinds of reasons why that happens, right? From cognitive biases to the difficulties of, like, you don't just have one person writing rules, and so there must be um, compromise, all of these sorts of things, right? And we have institutional snowballing. It's hard to just from scratch start over on something, right? All of our, even the tendrils of our institutions on the ground are doing things in a certain way, and it's hard to just upend everything immediately. And there are a whole bunch of reasons. Okay, and so Lindblom. It's man, oh, Lindblom suggests that policy is, quote, the political resultant of partisan mutual adjustment among various actors processing different information, adhering to different value structures, and driven by different individual or group interests, right? And so it's not the statist approach we sort of took at the beginning of the book. Um, it's yes, it's a model and it's a simplification, but it's not all that realistic. And so we have to remember that this is push pull. There's a lot of different factors that are affecting policy appraisal, analysis, etc. All right. Now, this is where Lindblom sort of takes a very normative approach and says this is the best way to approach policy. Again, I don't like that, but I'll present his argument. He says incrementalism has advantages. It requires a lot of information gathering. Um, I mean, excuse me, it does not require a lot of information gathering because of that pig guessing contest that I talked about in the former chapter. Um, because we'll generally come to a decent answer with multiple inputs, right? And so you don't always need a lot of information. Um, and you don't necessarily need agreement on objectives or priorities or whatever it might be, right? And it says this approach, this incrementalism approach, permits action where the rational ideal does not offer guidance, right? And this could be one of the problems of the rational model, is that sometimes there isn't an equilibrium, and sometimes it comes to an inefficient or suboptimal or not Nash equilibrium, right? And economists have a hard time explaining those things. Okay. Uh, Lindblom also says that information is incomplete, right? We talked about this asymptote, right? You'll never get 100% information. You'll never get 0% information. The lines never touch. It creates an S, right? And so while you can have more information if you want to spend the time and the resources, you'll never have complete information. And sometimes it's biased. And so the difficulty is trying to define an objective given everyone's different information set and also different ways of viewing the world and what is success and all of these things. And so this incremental approach can help us to overcome these barriers. Okay. Lindblom also says that this means policy tends to move from concrete goals to abstract ideals to be obtained, right? Maybe we don't even put a goal or an objective or some quantifiable success measure into place. Maybe this policy is about signaling ideals and abstractions and these sorts of things, right? Um, let's see. Oh, Lindblom dubs this remediality, right? We may never be able to specify well enough to even quantify a dependent variable or data or whatever, right? And so this idea that we move from this concrete, pragmatic data world to idealism and philosophy, et cetera, as goals, um, he calls remediality. He also next sort of says there's what we call adjustment of objectives to policies. And Lindblom is arguing basically that the ends and the means can't be separated. And sometimes you'll actually create a policy and then create the goals we want to see as feedback. And so that's pretty interesting, right? Um, he brings up the limit of focus to incremental alternatives, right? And we've talked about this. You need eyeballs or you need attention or you need a crisis, right? Because you can't spend your time on everything everywhere all at once, right? And so, yeah, this is why you tend to get incremental adjustments, especially from people from like policymakers in subcommittees or policy areas they are interested in, right? And they have decided to use their focus on this particular thing, right? Okay. He also says we have margin dependent choice. And this means that policymakers, organizations, whatever, will actually debate, discuss, talk about budgets way more than they talk about like the actual policy or what outcomes they're trying to get out of this or whatever. And so it just breaks down often into a budget debate about how this is going to affect marginal budget rates and increases and decreases and blah, blah, blah. And it's funny if you watch some of these subcommittee meetings on like C-SPAN and stuff, because they'll be talking about some issue and then it just all becomes about budgets. It's very interesting. So this was I was like, oh man, yeah, I've seen this play out in real life. And then finally, Lindblom says like one of the other problems with like rational choice approach and with their whole idea of how policymaking works is that policymaking is not static, right? Like it isn't just a single point in time. This is a serial issue, and you have these temporal interplay. All right. Section 22.3, preconditions for non-incremental change, right? When we do see big changes to policy or whatever, how does that come about? And we've covered some of this, so I won't hit it too hard. But we've got crisis, right? And this can involve maybe foreign policy crisis, like wars or terrorist attacks like 9/11, these sorts of things. And, this is why we had this enormous institutional change and sort of built what's called now the Department of Homeland Security. It's only existed for like 25 years or something. So it's not like the DHS has been around for a long time in American history. And then another one is economic crises, right? And there are plenty of others like environmental or whatever it might be. But the 2008 recession and the TARP temporary assistance, remedial, I don't know. I can't remember what it means, but this is where we threw like trillions of dollars, not even in the billions anymore, like trillions of dollars at banks and insurance companies, right? As the market was crashing, late 2007, 2008, this stuff. Okay. We also have the arousal of mass opinion. This is number two. This is how we can get sort of significant change instead of the incrementalism, right? And so the arousal of mass opinion. So I would point to like the civil rights era in America, late 1950s, moving into the 1960s. There is so much going on. There's people in the streets. There's violence. There's assassinations, right? Like this stuff was popping off. And so this can be a way that major changes happen. This is how we push through the war on poverty, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, all under Lyndon Baines Johnson. And then this is also where you get sort of the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. If we're talking about environmentalism, mass opinion around smog, around polluted rivers and water sources, around sort of effluent being dumped into the ground, all these sorts of things, right, led to the Nixon administration putting in the Environmental Protection Agency and a whole bunch of environmental laws. So yeah, interesting. And Nixon was a conservative, a Republican, and so these influences definitely change over time as to which party represents which things, right? All right. Number three, the final thing they say that can sort of create big changes is what they dub the attainment of conditions for rational decision making, right? This is the few times that we can actually get like major changes and scientific approaches and all of these sorts of things. Um, yeah, and so this is the third and final way that we can see almost that punctuated equilibrium model coming to life. Okay. Table 22.1, the four quadrants of policy change. Hmm. Okay. And they're basically just breaking down whether we have a high or low understanding of an issue, right? Or incremental and non-incremental change. And they're just sort of trying to graphically show this, right? Okay. 22.4, can incrementalism be trusted to yield good policies? And again, this is sort of where we get into that normative philosophical stuff. Um, and so you have a lot of criticisms of this, and the author tries to spend a lot of time also sort of rebutting those criticisms. But criticism is good. Okay, for everything, right? All right, four rationalist criticisms, right, from the people who sort of propound these economic and rationalist and game theoretic approaches. Number one, they argue that policy should be goal oriented and purposive, right? So, again, another sort of normative argument here. But the incrementalist approach from Lindblom basically is suggesting that, like, incrementalism and this passing laws through the lens of morality or tradition or culture or that what did they call it? What were the exact words they used? Shit, I can't find it. Well, I'm sorry. I wish I'd done better with the definitions, but that shift away from like having a numerically oriented goal to having a more idealism oriented goal, right? And so Lindblom's argument is that that's a good thing. The rationalist criticism is that like we should have goal-oriented policy and it should be purposive. Like we shouldn't be passing laws that don't have a purpose. Right? Okay. Number two, some rationalist critics argue that incrementalism and rationalism are at odds, But the authors sort of argue that this is a misrepresentation, right? Like we actually do use sort of the rationalist approach to even tinker around the margins and these sorts of things. Um, yeah, so analysis will actually be used for like information gathering, convincing veto players, convincing constituents, all of these things, right? The issue is that like everyone has their own data, and like can we come to an agreement socially that this is the data we should be using, right? Okay, the third rationalist critique argues that incrementalism is reactive rather than proactive, right? Um, and I think there's something to this, right? You can't marginally or incrementally change something unless it already exists. And so you're only sort of waiting for feedback to make incremental changes. And this really ties into this. There's a very famous piece by two guys named Cox and McCubbins, who wrote a famous piece about policing versus fire alarm, um, and how policing just doesn't make sense for policymakers because there's so many policies out there, there's so many social ills out there that you just can't constantly police everything and monitor everything. And so what we generally have is the fire alarm model. When something is going terribly awry, that's when we make changes, and that's when we shift our attention to something, right? And so, again, I don't really know which side to fall on, but there are different arguments about this. Okay, number four, rationalist critique of this incremental approach is the sleeper effect. And this is just the idea that sort of maybe we set a policy before we don't really understand it or understand the externalities or other things. And then once it's been institutionalized, it gains momentum and it's difficult to go back and change it. And so this can lead to difficulties with mass turnover, like I said earlier. If you have all of these, you know, what is a federal program? Like, let's say wildlife management or forestry or something, right? Like, there's thousands of them. And so, if you just want to completely upend policy all at once, like, there are difficulties with that, right? It's not easy. Institutions and their behaviors are sticky, right? In economics terminology. And so just mass turnover could be difficult or a waste or cost resources or all kinds of things, right? All right. They also offer some sort of anti-rationalist criticisms, right? That are not sort of being purported or propounded upon by the rationalist side of this field, right? And so there are two major critique or one major critique, and then we'll sort of focus on the U.S. at the end. But this sort of philosophical criticism of the incrementalist approach is that it is inherently conservative and status quo driven, right? And there is a preference for the status quo by the elites and by, I don't know, I guess those who are doing well in society and all these things. Um, and so, yeah, that's their frustration, I guess. And then the second is that because of institutional access and resources and power and donations and whatever it might be, um, this incremental approach, the suggestion is very favorable to the elites, right? The wealthy, the politically powerful, business leaders, these sorts of things, right? And even the guy who built all of this says, yeah, that's probably true, right? Um, and they have a lot of different sort of this legs up over the average citizen, right? So money, access. They also have high levels of resources for like technical expertise, regulatory issues, access to lawyers, all of these sort of things, right? Okay. We then move on to two sort of arguments against the US incrementalist system, right? And the first is checks and balances, right? And so there's this argument between the two sides, especially like parliamentarism versus this checks and balances system that we have, about like we can't shift out of incrementalism. It's incredibly difficult, nearly impossible, because of all the veto choke points. And so we just kind of have to learn to live with it. And so, yeah. Whereas, I don't know, a nation like most of Europe, uh, most of Europe, and then many South American countries, etc., their executive branch and their legislative branch and all the high level institutional positions are all run by the majority, either party or coalition in the parliament. Um, and so you can make massive changes very quickly as long as you can keep the voters happy and be the majority party or the majority coalition, right? And you don't get sort of a recall vote. Okay. The final one is they say there's a difficulty with divided government, right? And um, all interests basically have to have some input for incrementalism to work fairly. And I would say there's a little bit of a point to this, especially with our gerrymandering problem in America, where it incentivizes not playing well with others and not compromising and having sort of extremist views at the tail rather than trying to represent the median voter in your district and all of these things, right? And so this can also make it very difficult to have real discussions about how we change major policies, right? Okay, that's all I got for you on this one. Thanks for being here. I'll see you soon.